The phone rang at 6:17 in the morning. It was the kind of hour when bad news doesn't knock. It barges in, uninvited and heavy, like a stranger pushing through your front door without taking off their shoes. I was in the kitchen, standing over the kettle as it hissed, steam curling against the faded wallpaper. The light above the sink was weak, flickering now and then, as if even at new mornings in this house had been quiet for too long. My knees ached from the cold. The tiles seemed to hold the night in their bones. I'd been awake for over an hour, unable to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me the night before. The clock had ticked too loudly. The shadows in the hallway had seemed to lean in closer than usual. The second ring jolted me. My hand hovered over the receiver a moment longer than it should have, because somewhere in me a voice whispered, "Don't answer." I did anyway. "Mrs. Hanley?" The voice was sharp, professional, too brisk for that early. "This is St. Jude's Hospital. We need to inform you." Papers rustled on the other end, a page turning. "Your husband was admitted last night. Cardiac episode. He's stable, but..." The tone shifted. It was subtle, like a musician lowering the key mid-song. "We've been advised it's best if you don't come in today." I pressed my free hand to the counter, the edge digging into my palm. "Don't come in." I repeated. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, too calm for the storm I felt building in my chest. "My husband is in the hospital. I'm his wife." The pause that followed was not the pause of someone searching for the right words. It was the pause of someone deciding whether to say them at all. "We're only following instructions from the party listed on his chart," she said. The voice caught like she'd bitten back the rest of the sentence. "It's just not recommended that you visit at this time." I could hear the hum of hospital life in the background. The distant ding of an elevator, the beep of a monitor, a voice over the intercom calling for Dr. Patel to cardiology. "Who," I asked slowly, "gave you those instructions?" Silence stretched, thin but sharp. Then, "His wife." I felt the floor shift under me, though my feet hadn't moved. "I am his wife," I said. A softer exhale, almost a sigh. "Ma'am, I really can't." I hung up. Not because I wanted to, but because I could feel my control slipping and I wasn't going to give a stranger the sound of my voice breaking. The kettle whistled behind me, steam curling into the cold air. I poured the boiling water into my cup and watched it swirl dark as the tea steeped, but my hands didn't reach for the spoon. My mind was already on the highway, halfway down Route 46 toward St. Jude's. For 43 years I had been the first call when anything happened to William. The first to hold his hand in recovery. The first to sign the consent forms. The first to hear the bad news and the good. And now some stranger, some wife, had told them I shouldn't come. I looked at the clock again. 6:23. Visiting hours started at 8. 2 hours. 2 hours to decide whether to obey the warning or do the thing every bone in my body was screaming at me to do. I thought of the last time I'd been in that hospital, 2 winters ago when William had pneumonia. I'd sat by his bed through the night, keeping his blanket tucked tight, adjusting his pillows when he coughed. At 3 in the morning he'd woken and murmured my name like a child calling for comfort. But that was then. Now my name hadn't been on his lips. Someone else's had been. I pulled my coat from the hook by the door. The familiar weight settled over my shoulders, heavy but grounding. My purse was already on the counter. I'd taken to keeping it close these past few months. Habit maybe. Or instinct. Outside, the sky was the color of unwashed cotton, a pale, stubborn gray. Rain spat against the windows, thin and sideways, needling the glass. The driveway was empty except for my old sedan, still dusted from last week's grocery run. I slid into the driver's seat and sat there for a moment, the engine off, the keys cold in my palm. The voice from the phone echoed in my head. "It's best if you don't come in." I turned the key. The drive to St. Jude's was 26 minutes on a good day. I knew every turn, every stretch of cracked asphalt, every stoplight that liked to hold me longer than it should. Today the lights seemed to turn green just as I reached them. When I pulled into the hospital parking lot, it was still half empty, the morning shift just beginning. Nurses hurried through the mist with coffee cups and ID badges swinging from their necks. The automatic doors slid open with a sigh and the smell hit me, antiseptic and something faintly metallic. A smell that sticks to your hair long after you leave. At the reception desk, a young woman looked up, her eyes flicking from my face to the clipboard in front of her. Name: Eleanor Hanley. My husband, William. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Room 312. But, she hesitated. There's already someone in there with him. I didn't wait for her to finish. The hallway outside 312 was too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful but guarded. The steady beep of a heart monitor filtered through the door, in perfect time with the low hum of the fluorescent lights. I put my hand on the handle. And then I heard it, a laugh. Low, warm, intimate. Not his. A woman's. I pushed the door open. There she was, sitting in the chair by his bed. Her hand wrapped around his. Her face turned toward me with a look that was neither surprise nor guilt, but something worse. William's eyes opened at the sound of the door. For half a second I thought I saw relief there. But just as quickly he looked away toward her. I told you not to come, he murmured, voice rough from oxygen and sleep. I stepped into the room, my heart hammering so loud it drowned out the monitor. Not to come? I'm your wife, William. Who is this? The woman's smile didn't falter. I'm his wife too. The words hit the air like they'd been waiting there, ready to slice through me. I'm his wife too. I stood perfectly still, my hands still on the door, as if the floor beneath me had tilted and I needed to hold on to something. My first instinct was to laugh. A short, sharp laugh that would have made her look ridiculous, but the sound stuck in my throat. William didn't speak. He didn't rush to correct her, didn't tell her she was mistaken, didn't say the words I'd been silently begging him to say. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling like a man who'd decided silence was easier than truth. I'm sorry, what did you just say? My voice came out low, even. The kind of calm that wasn't calm at all, but the moment before a storm. She shifted in her chair, crossing her legs with an elegance that felt like a performance. I said, I'm his wife. We've been married for 6 years. 6 years. The number slid into my mind like a cold blade. I did the math automatically, the way you do when you're trying to place an unfamiliar face. 6 years ago. That was when William started traveling more for work. When he came home smelling of cologne I didn't buy and carrying hotel soaps in his suitcase. When his business trips to Arizona became so frequent, I'd started joking about him buying a cactus. Only now it wasn't a joke. I took a step closer to the bed, my eyes on William. Is this true? His lips parted like he might answer, but instead he coughed, a weak, shallow cough, and turned his head away. Eleanor, I'm tired, he murmured. I wasn't. I was awake now in a way I hadn't been in years. My hands didn't shake, not even a little. The woman, she couldn't have been more than mid-50s, her blonde hair styled in soft waves, makeup flawless, reached over and smoothed the blanket over William's chest, her movements claiming practiced. He doesn't need this right now, she said, her tone gentle but dismissive. You should go home. Rest. Let me take care of him. Let her take care of him. As if I hadn't been doing exactly that for more than 4 decades. I moved to the other side of the bed, placing myself opposite her, my hand resting lightly on the rail. I'll go when I'm ready, I said, each word measured. She didn't back down. Her eyes held mine, calm and almost pitying, like I was the one who didn't understand the situation. I know this is hard for you, she said. But he loves me. My jaw tightened. Does he love you enough to tell you about me? Something flickered in her eyes then, the briefest shadow. But it was gone before I could call it out. William closed his eyes, and for a second I thought he might speak, but he stayed silent. That silence told me more than words ever could. I leaned in close enough that only he could hear me. I'll be back, I whispered. And when I come back we'll see just how complicated this really is. As I straightened she stood too. Her perfume hit me, expensive, floral, the kind that clings. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, she said softly. But it was already hard. I walked out of the room without looking back, but every step down that hallway felt heavier. I passed the nurse's station, caught a few glances, heard the low murmur of voices I couldn't quite catch. My shoes clicked against the linoleum in a rhythm that matched the beat of my own thoughts. 6 years. 6 years. 6 years. I didn't drive straight home. Instead, I parked in the far corner of the hospital lot, away from the main entrance, where the asphalt cracked and weeds pushed through in thin green defiance. I sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel, staring at nothing. The rain had slowed to a mist, beating on the windshield. I didn't turn on the wipers. The blurred view suited me. It felt like the world was just as unclear as my own mind. A memory surfaced, uninvited. It was our 30th anniversary. William had surprised me with a weekend in Sedona. I remembered the red rock glowing at sunset, the quiet hum of cicadas, the way he'd slipped his arm around my waist as we stood on the hotel balcony. He'd kissed my temple and said, "Here's to us forever." Now I wondered if forever had already been shared with someone else by then. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles pale. I wasn't just hurt, I was angry. Angry at him for lying. Angry at her for sitting in my chair by his bed. Angry at myself for not seeing it sooner. And under the anger was something sharper. Determination. She might have been there when he woke up this morning. She might think she held the upper hand. But I had history. I had 43 years of marriage, a shared home, shared children, shared losses. And if she wanted to pretend those didn't matter, I'd make sure the law reminded her otherwise. Back home, I moved through the house like I was seeing it for the first time. The wedding photo in the hallway, the one with my veil blowing across my face, now looked like a lie framed in silver. His coat still hung on the hook by the door, the sleeves worn where his elbows bent. In the bedroom, the dent in his pillow was still there from the night before. I stood there for a long moment, then pulled open the dresser drawer where he kept his travel toiletries. Inside were the usual things: a razor, travel-sized toothpaste, but tucked in the back was a small matchbook. It was from a diner in Arizona. I held it in my palm, flipping it open. Inside was a phone number written in looping, feminine handwriting. That was when I stopped feeling like a victim and started feeling like an investigator. I carried the matchbook into the kitchen and set it on the table. The steam from the kettle had long since faded, leaving my tea cold and uninviting, but I sat there anyway, staring at the tiny rectangle of cardboard as if it might answer the questions screaming in my head. The number inside wasn't local. I recognized the area code immediately: Arizona. I reached for the old spiral-bound notepad I kept by the phone. The first few pages were grocery lists and reminders to pay the electric bill, but further back were my notes from the last few years. Little things I'd jotted down when William's stories didn't quite line up. April 14th. Trip extended, flight delayed. Came home with sunburn. May 3rd. Dinner cancelled last minute. Client crisis. October 9th. Phone turned off by mistake while traveling. They'd all felt harmless at the time, just the quirks of a man with a busy schedule. But now, looking at them in one place, they felt like breadcrumbs on a trail I should have followed long ago. I took a breath, letting my fingers rest on the cool surface of the table. In all our years together, I had never once snooped through his things. I'd believed in giving him privacy, in trusting the man I'd married. And what had that trust bought me? A stranger's voice on the phone calling herself his wife. The clock over the sink ticked louder than usual. The hours between that phone call and the hospital visit stretched like they'd been pulled taut. I tried to distract myself with housework, wiping down counters, folding laundry, but my mind kept circling back to the same image. A woman sitting by William's bed, her hand wrapped around his, looking at me like I was the intruder. The memory of her face sharpened the longer I thought about it. Her perfectly drawn eyebrows, her calm confidence, the way she didn't flinch when I walked in. That was the part that stayed with me. Most people caught in something they shouldn't be part of look guilty. He didn't. She looked established. Like she'd been there 100 times before. At 7:40, I picked up my purse and slipped the matchbook inside. I wasn't sure yet if I'd use it, but I knew better than to leave it behind. The drive to the hospital was shorter than usual. The streets were nearly empty. My mind wandered as the car hummed along the wet asphalt. I thought about the first time William had ever been in the hospital years ago, after he'd fallen from a ladder while fixing the roof. I'd spent that night in a hard plastic chair beside his bed, holding his hand, watching the rise and fall of his chest. He'd woken at 3 in the morning, smiled at me and said, "I knew you'd be here." Now, 6 years into some other life I hadn't known about, he'd made sure someone else would be there instead. Inside St. Jude's, the smell was the same as every hospital. Antiseptic and something faintly metallic like the ghost of blood and bleach. The reception desk was manned by a young woman with tired eyes who tried to smile as I approached. "Name?" she asked. "Eleanor Hanley." "My husband, William." She scanned her clipboard. "Room 312. But," her eyes lifted to mine, "there's already someone in there with him." I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt longer than the drive here. The air was cool and stale, the hum of the machinery mixing with the soft hiss of my own breath. When the doors slid open, I stepped into a corridor lined with identical doors, each marked with small silver numbers. Room 312 was near the end. I paused outside, hand on the handle. Through the thin wood, I could hear the steady beep of a monitor and the low murmur of a voice I didn't recognize. Then came the sound that made my stomach knot. Laughter. Not his. Hers. I pushed the door open. William lay propped against a stack of hospital pillows, his skin pale but his eyes alert. Sitting beside him, her hand wrapped around his, was a woman I had never seen before in my life. She wore a navy dress that spoke of quiet wealth, her blonde hair styled just so, makeup flawless in that effortless way that takes effort. She turned toward me slowly, her expression unchanging. No surprise, no guilt. Just the faint curve of a smile. "You must be the other wife," she said. The words floated between us, daring me to react. I stepped fully into the room, letting the door swing shut behind me. "I'm his wife," I said, each word sharp and deliberate. "Who are you?" She leaned back slightly in her chair, still holding his hand. "I'm his wife too. We've been married for 6 years. My gaze shot to William. "Is this true?" He looked away. "Eleanor, I'm tired." I took another step closer, the sound of my shoes on the linoleum loud in the small room. "Tired is one thing. Lying for 6 years is another." The woman smoothed the blanket over William's chest, her touch gentle but claiming. "He doesn't need this stress," she said softly. "You should go home. Let me take care of him." I moved to the opposite side of the bed, close enough to smell the faint floral perfume she wore. "I'll go when I'm ready," I said. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. "You can make this easy or you can make it hard. Either way, you'll have to accept it." William closed his eyes again, retreating into the silence he'd been keeping from the moment I walked in. That silence told me everything. I leaned down so my face was level with his. "I'll be back," I whispered. "And when I come back, we'll see just how complicated this really is." I straightened, my eyes meeting hers. She held my gaze, confident, unflinching. But I saw it, the tiniest flicker of uncertainty. And that flicker was enough to tell me she didn't know what I was capable of. For a long moment, none of us moved. The hum of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. The slow, steady beep felt like a metronome for a song I didn't recognize anymore. The woman didn't release his hand. She sat there as if my presence were an inconvenience, not a threat. As if she had been sitting in that chair for years and my arrival was just a disruption to her routine. "You heard me," she said finally, her voice smooth, deliberate. "I'm his wife too." The words were calm, but their weight hit me like a sudden drop in the floor beneath my feet. I shifted my eyes to William, willing him to meet my gaze. He didn't. His eyes drifted to the window instead, as if something out there, a tree swaying, a passing car, was suddenly worth studying. "William," I said, my voice quieter now but sharper at the edges. "Is this true?" His chest rose and fell in a slow, measured breath. "Eleanor, I'm tired," he said. "Tired." That was his answer. Not denial. Not outrage. Just tired. The woman smoothed the blanket over his chest with a practiced touch, the kind of care you give to someone you believe is yours. "He doesn't need this right now," she said, glancing at me without really looking. "Stress isn't good for his recovery. You should go home. Rest." I felt something coil tight inside me, not rage exactly, but the cold clarity that comes when you realize the rules have changed and you are no longer playing the same game. I stepped closer, placing my hand lightly on the rail of the bed opposite her. "I'll go when I'm ready," I said. She met my gaze fully now, her eyes an icy blue that didn't blink. "You can make this easy or you can make it hard. But either way," she let the sentence trail off as if the ending was so obvious it didn't need saying. "Either way," I prompted. "Either way, you'll have to accept it," she said. I studied her face. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't defensive. She had the stillness of someone confident in her place. That confidence was the most dangerous thing in the room. A nurse appeared in the doorway then, her eyes darting between us. "Everything all right in here?" she asked, her voice polite but wary. The woman smiled sweetly at the nurse. "Everything's fine," she said. I didn't correct her. "Not here. Not yet." The nurse adjusted William's fore and murmured something about checking back later before slipping out again. The silence returned, thick as the scent of the woman's perfume. Expensive and floral. the kind that lingers in fabric long after the wearer is gone. I took a step back, my eyes never leaving hers. "I'll be back," I said, my voice low but steady. Her smile widened just slightly. "I'll be here." I turned and walked out, not because she told me to, but because staying any longer would have been like playing a game with rules I didn't yet understand. I needed to learn those rules first. The hallway outside room 312 felt colder than it had on the way in. My shoes clicked against the linoleum, each step pulling me further from the bed where she sat and closer to the space where my thoughts could stretch out without her watching me. I passed the nurse's station. One of them glanced up at me, then quickly looked away. I caught the faint murmur of voices, the quiet buzz of gossip that fills places like this. I didn't slow down to listen. I already knew what they were talking about. In the elevator, I caught my reflection in the mirrored doors. My face looked the same as it had that morning, but my eyes were different. Sharper. More alert. It was the look of someone who had been blindsided but wasn't planning to stay that way. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I found myself in the small coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital. The bell over the door jingled softly as I stepped inside. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods wrapped around me, warm and familiar, but I didn't feel comforted. I ordered a black coffee I didn't want and took it to the corner booth where I could see the whole room. The steam rose in lazy curls from the cup, but my mind wasn't here. It was back in that hospital room, replaying every detail. The way her hand fit so naturally in his, the way she looked at me like I was the intruder, the way he chose silence over truth. I reached into my purse and pulled out the notepad I kept for grocery lists and phone messages. On a fresh page, I wrote down everything I could remember from that encounter. Her appearance, her voice, her confidence, the exact words she used. Then I circled one phrase over and over. 6 years. 6 years ago, William's business trips had increased. 6 years ago, he'd started keeping his phone face down on the table. 6 years ago, our anniversary trip had been canceled for a last-minute client meeting. Individually, they had been small things. Together, they painted a picture I didn't want to look at but couldn't ignore. I flipped back through the notebook, scanning old entries. There they were, the little red flags I had tucked away in ink. I told myself then that every marriage has unexplained moments. Now I saw them for what they were. I left the coffee shop with more than caffeine in my system. I left with a plan forming in the back of my mind. Back at the hospital, I didn't go to his room. I went to the reception desk. The woman there was the same one from earlier, her expression polite but guarded. "I need to see my husband's file," I said. "I'm sorry, but..." "I'm his wife," I interrupted, my voice firm. "I have a legal right to know who has access to him." She hesitated, glanced over her shoulder, then lowered her voice. "We have 2 names on file as spouse. Yours and hers." The words landed like ice water. "That's not possible." "Ma'am, she has a marriage license on record. Different state. It's valid." "Which state?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Arizona." I turned without another word, walking out into the parking lot where the sun had broken through the clouds, casting everything in a light that felt too bright for what I'd just learned. I sat in my car for a long time, the hum of the engine off, the world outside moving in slow motion. A marriage license. A legal document tying my husband to another woman. If there was a license, there were witnesses. If there were witnesses, there were photographs. And if there were photographs, there was a story, one they'd tried to keep from me. The question wasn't whether I would find it. The question was whether I was ready for what I'd see when I did. By the time I got home from the hospital, the afternoon light had shifted. The sun was lower, throwing long shadows across the living room. I set my purse on the table and stood there listening to the quiet. The clock ticked in the kitchen. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice, then fell silent. I'd always loved this house for its stillness. Now it felt like a shell, four walls holding the echo of a life I wasn't sure had ever been as real as I'd believed. On the hall table, the wedding photo caught my eye. 43 years ago, William had stood beside me in a gray suit, his hand wrapped around mine, his smile wide enough to make my cheeks ache from smiling back. I lifted the frame, ran my thumb over the glass, and wondered if that man still existed, or if he had disappeared somewhere along the way. The photo didn't give me an answer, so I set it face down. I didn't sit. I didn't turn on the TV or make tea. I went straight to the bedroom closet and pulled down the fireproof lockbox we kept on the top shelf. The key was still in the small dish on the dresser where it had always been. Inside the box were all the documents of our life together. Birth certificates, passports, tax returns, property deeds. I flipped through them quickly at first, then slower, looking for anything with a date in the last 6 years. Most of it was ordinary. But tucked between 2 old mortgage statements was a manila envelope with no label. I slid it open. Inside were travel receipts, hotel confirmations from Arizona, car rentals, flight itineraries. I'd seen plenty of these over the years, but they'd always been emailed to him, not printed and tucked away. The earliest one was dated exactly 6 years ago in May. Same month she'd said their marriage began. I set the receipts aside in a neat stack. Evidence, my mind whispered. In the back of the box was another envelope, this one thinner. I recognized the handwriting on the front immediately. Williams. It said, personal. I hesitated. Opening it felt like crossing a line. But then I remembered her hand on his in that hospital room, the way she'd looked at me like I was the one who needed to leave. I opened it. Inside was a single photograph. William stood in front of a small whitewashed chapel with a woman in a cream dress beside him. She held a bouquet of desert wildflowers, her blonde hair catching the sunlight. Behind them, the red rock cliffs of Arizona glowed in the evening light. I didn't need to see her face to know it was her. I don't remember sitting down, but suddenly I was on the edge of the bed, the photograph in my lap. My fingers curled around the edges until they bent. For 6 years, this picture had been sitting here, hidden in the one place I never thought to look. The box we both agreed was for important things. My stomach turned. Not from shock anymore. That part was fading. What was left was something steadier, colder. I picked up my phone and opened the search bar. I typed the name of the chapel. It was printed on the corner of one of the receipts. Within seconds, a page of images appeared. The same red cliffs. The same white walls. I clicked through until I found a photograph of the chapel's front desk. On the counter was a small sign. All marriage licenses processed through Coconino County Clerk. That was my next stop. I didn't go right away. I knew better than to rush without a plan. First I called Daniel Reeves. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I still had his number written in my address book. A habit from before cell phones made everyone's contacts invisible. Daniel was an attorney I'd met when a neighbor fought an inheritance case. He had a way of asking questions that made people tell him more than they intended. When he answered, his voice was the same, smooth, measured. Eleanor. It's been a long time. I need to know what happens when a man marries 2 women in 2 different states, I said. There was a pause. Is this hypothetical? No. All right, he said slowly. Come by tomorrow morning. We'll talk. That night I didn't cook dinner. I didn't sleep much either. I sat at the kitchen table with the photograph and the receipts spread out in front of me like puzzle pieces. The longer I stared, the more the timeline sharpened. The first trip 6 years ago. The steady rhythm of travel every other month. The cancelled anniversaries. The unexplained client meetings. There had been a whole second life running alongside mine, close enough for him to keep both going, far enough for me not to see until now. At 2 in the morning, I pulled out my notebook and began listing everything I needed to do. 1. Get a copy of the Arizona marriage license. 2. Pull our joint bank statements for the last 6 years. 3. Contact Daniel with all documents. 4. Find out everything I can about her. By the time I capped my pen, the first hints of dawn were softening the edges of the dark. In the morning, I dressed in dark slacks and a sweater, clothes that wouldn't draw attention. I drove to the library where the public computers were tucked in the back near the genealogy section. I typed her description into the search bar. Blonde, mid-50s, Arizona. That was too broad, so I added Hanley and marriage. 3 pages in, I found it. An online wedding announcement from a small-town Arizona paper. 6 years ago. William Hanley and Margaret Allen, married at Sunset Chapel. A photograph accompanied the article. The same one I had in the envelope, cropped closer. She wasn't just a name anymore. She was a person with a history. And I was going to know every piece of it. The rest of the day was spent building the beginnings of a file. I printed the announcement, the receipts, the hotel confirmations. I even printed the photograph from the newspaper, tucking it alongside the one from the envelope. By evening, my dining room table was covered in neat stacks of paper. I looked at them all, feeling the weight of what they represented. 6 years of betrayal laid out in ink and photographs. And this was only the start. Tomorrow I'd put it all in Daniel's hands. Tomorrow the fight would begin. The next morning was cold enough for frost to lace the edges of the grass in my front yard. I scraped a thin layer from the windshield before sliding into the driver's seat, my hands stiff around the steering wheel. Daniel Reeves's office was 20 minutes away, in the old part of town where the streets narrowed and the sidewalks were cracked from decades of tree roots pushing upward. I remembered the place well. A 2-story brick building with tall windows and brass letters on the door that read Reeves and Cole, attorneys at law. When I pushed the door open, the smell of old paper and polished wood greeted me, the kind of smell that made you feel like the walls had heard 1,000 secrets. Daniel's receptionist, a petite woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, looked up from her desk. "Mrs. Hanley?" "Yes. I have an appointment with Mr. Reeves." She nodded. "He's expecting you. Go right in." Daniel stood as I entered, coming around from behind his desk to shake my hand. He hadn't changed much. Still tall, still wearing those thin-rimmed glasses that made him look like he could see through people. "Eleanor," he said warmly. "It's been far too long." I set my purse on the chair beside me and handed him the manila folder I'd prepared. "I don't know where to start, so I'm just going to give you everything I have." He flipped it open, scanning the receipts, the photographs, the wedding announcement. His eyes didn't widen. His expression didn't shift. He just kept turning pages, the only sound the faint rustle of paper. When he reached the last sheet, he set the folder down and leaned back in his chair. "Tell me exactly how you found this." I went through it from the beginning. The phone call, the hospital, the woman's words, the photograph in the envelope, the search at the library. I kept my voice steady, but I could hear the undercurrent in it. The mix of anger and something colder. Daniel listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled under his chin. When I finished, he was silent for a moment, then he reached for his pen and began jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. "Eleanor," he said finally, "this is what we call a bigamy case. And it's not just a moral issue, it has legal teeth. Arizona recognizes a second marriage as valid only if it's entered in good faith. The moment we prove you were still legally married to him when he married her, that marriage becomes void." "So she's not his wife," I said. "Not in the eyes of the law," he confirmed, "which means she has no spousal rights. No claim to property, to bank accounts, to anything legally tied to his name. If she's been accessing his finances, we could be looking at fraud or theft." The words sank in slowly. I thought of her sitting beside him in that hospital room, her hand on his, her calm assurance that I'd have to accept it. "And me?" I asked. "What does this mean for me?" Daniel's voice stayed level. "You're the legal wife. That means you have first claim to everything. His assets, his pension, even control over medical decisions if it comes to that. Depending on how he's structured his accounts, you could undo every transfer he's made in her favor over the last 6 years." It was strange hearing it laid out like that. For weeks I'd been on the back foot, reacting to every blow. Now the balance was shifting. Daniel tapped his pen against the folder. "First step, we get certified copies of both marriage licenses. Yours and hers. Second, we pull his financial records. Bank accounts, retirement funds, investments. I'll subpoena what we can't access voluntarily." I nodded, already picturing the dining room table covered in paper again. "And then?" I asked. "Then we let them know you're not walking away quietly." I left his office with a list of tasks and a renewed sense of purpose. The frost had melted from the grass, the sun catching on the wet pavement as I walked to my car. My hands still shook, but it wasn't from the cold anymore. On the drive home, I thought about the conversation I'd eventually have with William. The way he'd look at me when he realized I wasn't just hurt, I was ready. But before I could face him, I had another stop to make. The Coconino County Clerk's office sat in a squat, beige building that looked like it had been designed by someone who didn't care much for windows. Inside, the air was dry and warm, the faint smell of toner in the air. A clerk with bright red glasses greeted me from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" "I need a copy of a marriage license," I said. "Names. William Hanley and Margaret Allen. 6 years ago." Her fingers flew over the keyboard. A moment later she nodded. "Found it. That'll be $10. When she slid the paper across the counter, I picked it up carefully as if it were fragile. There it was, his name, her name, the date, the officiant's signature. Proof on official letterhead. I folded it neatly and slid it into my purse. Back home, I added it to the folder for Daniel. The paper felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight but because of what it meant. I sat for a long time at the dining room table, staring at the neat stacks of evidence. My pulse was steady now, my breathing even. The woman in that hospital room had told me I'd have to accept it. She had no idea what I was willing to accept and what I wasn't. That night I dreamed of the hospital room. Only this time I wasn't standing at the foot of the bed. I was sitting in the chair beside it, and she was the one standing in the doorway watching me hold his hand. When I woke, I knew one thing for certain. The next time we met, I wouldn't be the one caught off guard. The hospital looked different this time. It wasn't the building. Same beige brick walls, same parking lot lines worn thin by years of tires. It was me. I was walking in not as the blindsided wife but as the legal spouse with evidence in my bag and a plan forming in my mind. The automatic doors opened with a hiss. Inside, the air was cool, laced with the faint scent of disinfectant and something metallic. I paused just long enough to scan the lobby. People in scrubs moved quickly, clipboards in hand. Visitors clutched flowers or fast food bags, faces marked by worry or exhaustion. I moved toward the elevator with steady steps, the strap of my purse cutting a diagonal line across my chest. Inside that purse was the Coconino County marriage license, the paper that turned her world into a castle built on sand. When I reached the third floor, the hallway seemed quieter than I remembered. The floor was polished to a shine, reflecting the fluorescent lights in neat, unbroken lines. My shoes clicked softly as I made my way toward room 312. Halfway there I saw her. Margaret. She was standing at the nurse's station, leaning slightly over the counter, speaking to a young nurse with dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Margaret's voice was warm, almost conspiratorial, and she laughed softly at something the nurse said. The laugh caught me off guard, not because it was pleasant but because it was familiar. I'd heard that exact tone before in my own kitchen when she thought she'd charmed someone into seeing things her way. She hadn't noticed me yet. I slowed my pace, watching her posture. She stood like someone who belonged, like this floor was hers to oversee. When she finally turned and saw me, it happened in a flicker, the briefest crack in her expression before the smile returned. "Eleanor," she said smoothly, as if greeting a neighbor she didn't particularly like but had to be polite to. "Back again so soon?" "I had some time," I replied, my voice even. "Thought I'd check on my husband." The young nurse glanced between us, sensing the invisible line drawn in the air, then excused herself to the far end of the counter. Margaret shifted her weight slightly, resting one manicured hand on the edge of the counter. "He's resting," she said. "Rough morning. Best not to wake him." "I'll decide that," I said, stepping closer. Her smile didn't fade, but her eyes sharpened. "We don't need to make this unpleasant." "Unpleasant?" I tilted my head. "I'm just visiting my husband. That's not unpleasant." I didn't wait for her to respond. I walked past her, down the hall and into room 312. William lay with his eyes closed, the steady rhythm of the heart monitor filling the quiet. The blanket was pulled up to his chest, his hands resting neatly on top. I stood beside the bed for a moment, looking at him, at the man I'd shared a lifetime with, at the lines on his face carved by both time and choices. I wondered if he'd wake, if he'd speak, if he'd have anything to say that I hadn't already heard before in one form or another. Behind me, the door eased open. Margaret stepped in, closing it softly behind her. "I told you he's tired," she said. I didn't turn. "I'm sure he is." We stood in silence for a long moment, the tension stretching between us like a wire. Finally I faced her. "I went to Arizona." That got her. Not much, just a slight tightening around her mouth, but enough. "I see," she said slowly. "I know about Sunset Chapel," I continued. "About the red cliffs. About the wildflowers in your bouquet." Her chin lifted slightly, her eyes holding mine. "Then you know he chose me." I smiled faintly. "He married me first." Her lips pressed together just for a second before she spoke again. "You can't change what we have." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You'd be surprised what I can change." I didn't push further. Not today. This wasn't the moment to reveal everything. Instead, I turned back to William, smoothing the blanket at his side with deliberate calm. "Rest, William," I said softly. "You're going to need it." When I left the room, Margaret followed me into the hall. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said. I stopped, looking at her over my shoulder. No, Margaret. I'm making it exactly as hard as it should be. Then I walked away, the weight of the marriage license in my bag like an anchor, grounding me, reminding me that the tide was already turning. That night at home, I sat at the dining room table again, the stacks of evidence neatly arranged. I added a new sheet to the pile. Observation: Margaret unsettled by Arizona mention. Keep pressing this nerve. As I capped my pen, I realized something. For the first time since this began, I wasn't dreading the next encounter. I was looking forward to it. The morning light crept in through the kitchen blinds in thin, golden lines. I sat at the table, coffee cooling beside the stacks of paper that had become my constant companions. The marriage license from Arizona sat at the top, the ink on it sharp and unforgiving. I'd been thinking about Margaret's face when I mentioned Sunset Chapel. The faint tightening around her mouth, the pause before she spoke. It wasn't fear exactly, but it was something close. Something I could work with. The phone rang, pulling me from the thought. Daniel Reeves's name lit up the screen. "Morning, Eleanor," he said when I answered. "I've been digging." I sat up straighter. "And? You were right to start this. I've confirmed the Arizona marriage is void under bigamy laws. But here's the part you'll want to hear. She's been using his name to open joint accounts. Some of those accounts have seen large withdrawals in the past year. We're talking tens of thousands." I felt my grip tighten on the phone. "Can we prove it?" "We can," he said. "And once we do, we can freeze them." By the time I reached his office later that morning, Daniel had already laid out a series of steps on a yellow legal pad. "First," he said, tapping his pen against the pad, "we file a formal notice with the hospital establishing you as the sole legal spouse. That cuts her off from making any medical or financial decisions for him. Second, we initiate proceedings to secure all jointly held accounts. Third," he glanced up at me, "we let her know in no uncertain terms that her time in this story is ending." I leaned forward. "What do you mean by that?" He gave a thin smile. "Sometimes, Eleanor, people like her back down before the fight even starts. If they believe the cost will be too high. We'll make sure she sees that cost in very clear numbers." It was just after lunch when I walked back into the hospital. This time I didn't go to room 312 first. I went straight to the nurse manager's office. A tall woman in a navy blazer looked up from her desk as I stepped inside. "Can I help you?" "Yes. I'm Eleanor Hanley. I'm here to deliver documentation regarding my husband's care." I handed her the folder Daniel had prepared. A certified copy of our marriage license, a notarized statement from him confirming my sole spousal status, and a formal request that all medical decisions go through me. She flipped through it, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read. "Understood," she said finally. "We'll update his file immediately." As I turned to leave, she added, "And just so you're aware, this means no one else can make decisions without your consent." "I'm aware," I said. "That's the point." I found Margaret in the hallway outside William's room, phone in hand, voice low. She looked up as I approached, slipping the phone into her bag. "What are you doing here again?" she asked. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "You might want to check with the nurses," I said. "Your access has changed." Her eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "Ask them," I said, brushing past her into the room. William was awake this time, his eyes following me as I set my bag on the chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" I asked. He hesitated. "Tired." I studied his face, searching for any trace of guilt, but all I saw was the weariness of someone who didn't want to be in the middle of two storms. Margaret stepped in a moment later, her smile brittle. "The nurses say they can't discuss his care with me anymore," she said. "That's right," I replied without looking at her. "From now on, everything goes through me." She crossed her arms. "You think this is going to scare me?" "I don't think anything," I said, finally meeting her gaze. "I know." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she laughed softly, the same laugh I'd heard at the nurse's station. "We'll see how long you can keep this up," she said and walked out. That night, Daniel called again. "She's already trying to move money," he said. "We intercepted the transfer. She knows now that the accounts are under scrutiny." "Good," I said. "Let her squirm." He paused. "Eleanor, you're playing this well. But remember, she's not going to go quietly. The more we close in, the more desperate she'll get." I'm counting on it, I said. Over the next few days, I made a point of visiting the hospital at different times. Sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening. Each time I stayed calm, polite, and unshakable. Margaret never knew when I'd appear, and that uncertainty began to wear on her. I saw it in the way she avoided my eyes, in the way her voice lost its smoothness when she spoke to the nurses. Even William seemed to sense the shift, though he said little. Every visit was a move on the board. Every glance, every carefully chosen word, part of a larger game she didn't even know the rules to yet. And the best part? We were only getting started. 3 days after the hospital file was updated, I walked into room 312 expecting the same quiet scene. William resting, Margaret hovering, the steady beep of the heart monitor filling the silence. Instead, the bed was empty. For a second my pulse jumped, until I saw the folded blanket and the untouched pillow. No signs of panic. No code blue. Just absence. I turned and spotted a nurse entering the room with a clipboard. "Where is he?" I asked. She looked startled. "He's in imaging for some follow-up scans. Should be back in about 40 minutes. I nodded, but something in her voice made me pause. She was avoiding my eyes. I stepped out into the hallway and saw Margaret at the far end, her phone pressed to her ear, pacing near the vending machines. Her posture was taut, one hand gripping her bag strap like it might keep her anchored. I stayed back, partly in shadow, just close enough to catch her voice. "Yes, it's under his name, but the account number is..." She stopped suddenly, glancing around, lowering her voice. Even without hearing the rest, I knew. He was trying again. Moving money. Maybe even something bigger this time. I walked toward her, slow and deliberate. She turned just as I reached her, her expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "Eavesdropping now?" she said. "Just curious who you'd be talking to from the hospital hallway," I replied evenly. "Especially when it sounds like you're giving them my husband's account numbers." Her eyes narrowed, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, I think I do," I said. "And so does my lawyer. Every transfer you attempt from here on out will be intercepted. But by all means, keep making the calls. It helps us build the case." She stepped closer, lowering her voice until I could feel her breath on my cheek. "You think you're clever, Eleanor. But you're not the only one who knows how to play this game." I smiled faintly. "The difference is, Margaret, I'm playing with the law on my side. You're just playing." Before she could answer, a voice over the intercom announced that the imaging team was returning patients to the 3rd floor. I brushed past her and headed toward the elevators. When William was wheeled back into the room, he looked pale but awake. His eyes flicked between us, sensing the tension like a sudden drop in air pressure. "What's going on?" he asked. I smoothed the blanket over his legs. "Nothing you need to worry about. Just making sure you're being taken care of." Margaret stood on the other side of the bed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You mean making sure you control everything?" "That's called being a wife," I said, not looking at her. "A real one." Later that afternoon, I met Daniel in his office. I told him about the phone call in the hallway, the attempted transfer. He tapped his pen against his legal pad. "That's good for us. Shows a pattern of behavior. Repeated attempts even after being warned. Judges don't like that. It'll play in our favor if this goes to court." "And if she keeps pushing?" I asked. He smiled thinly. "Then she'll be handing us the rope to hang her case with." Over the next week, Margaret's veneer began to crack. She showed up at the hospital earlier, left later, sometimes skipped meals just to keep an eye on me. But the more time she spent there, the more mistakes she made. Snapping at nurses, raising her voice with billing staff, making calls in places she thought were private but weren't. I didn't have to push much. All I had to do was be there, calm and steady, while she unraveled in public view. One afternoon, I arrived to find her arguing with a hospital administrator in the hallway. The administrator's arms were crossed, his voice firm. "As I've explained, Ms. Allen, we can't release those records to you without Mrs. Hanley's consent. That's the law." I stepped forward, my voice light. "Is there a problem?" Margaret turned, her face flushed. "They're refusing to give me William's billing records. I have a right to see them." "No," I said, "you don't. But if you'd like, I can get a copy and send it to my lawyer. He can forward you what's relevant, if there's anything at all." Her jaw worked, but no words came. She turned sharply and walked away. That night, Daniel called again. She's getting sloppy, Eleanor. I think she's starting to realize she can't win this outright. Which means she might try something desperate and soon. Let her, I said. I'll be ready. And I was. Because for the first time since this began, Margaret wasn't the one setting the pace anymore. I was. It started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to get. I was making tea in the kitchen when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in my gut told me to answer. Mrs. Hanley? A man's voice asked. Yes. This is Carl Lewis from Desert Valley Bank in Phoenix. We just wanted to confirm a wire transfer authorization you submitted this morning for $45,000. The spoon in my hand froze. Excuse me. Yes, ma'am. The transfer request came through in your name, from a joint account with William Hanley. We have the documentation here. That's impossible, I cut in. I didn't submit any transfer request. There was a pause. I see. In that case, we'll put an immediate hold on the transaction and flag the account for fraud review. Do that, I said. And please send a copy of that documentation to my attorney, Daniel Reeves. Yes, ma'am. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, not from fear but from a slow, simmering fury. She'd done it again, only this time she'd forged my name. By the time I reached Daniel's office, he already had the fax from the bank. He slid it across the desk to me. It was my name in neat cursive on the transfer form. Only it wasn't my hand. The slant was wrong. The loops in the letters were too perfect, like someone had traced them from a sample. She's not just reckless, Daniel said, his voice low. She's criminal. What now? I asked. We could take this to the police today and have her arrested for forgery and attempted theft. But I think there's a better way. I raised an eyebrow. Better than having her in handcuffs? He leaned forward. Eleanor, people like Margaret don't think they can lose until the loss is staring them in the face. I say we set the stage, make her think she's winning, and then pull the rug out from under her in one clean sweep. That afternoon, I drove straight to the hospital. Margaret was sitting by William's bed, flipping through a glossy magazine. You look smug, I said lightly, closing the door behind me. Her eyes flicked up. Just enjoying a quiet afternoon. Some of us don't need constant drama. I smiled faintly. Oh, I'm sure you prefer things calm. Especially when you're busy signing my name to bank transfers. Her magazine lowered an inch. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie, Margaret, I said, stepping closer. The bank called me. They have the paperwork. And my lawyer has it now too. Her lips curved into something between a smirk and a sneer. You think you can scare me with that? I tilted my head. I don't need to scare you. I just need you to keep doing exactly what you're doing. For the next 3 days I played it cool. I didn't confront her again. I didn't even linger in the hospital hallways. I just visited William, made polite conversation and left. Margaret seemed almost buoyant, as if she believed she'd gotten away with something. She chatted with nurses again, laughed in the cafeteria, even wore a bright scarf like she was celebrating something. What she didn't know was that Daniel was moving behind the scenes, freezing accounts, filing preliminary fraud reports, and securing a court order that would not only block her access to William's finances but also bar her from the hospital if necessary. The trap was nearly set. On the 4th day I arrived earlier than usual. Margaret was in the room, but this time she wasn't smiling. She was on the phone, her voice low and urgent. I don't care what the paperwork says, she hissed. He wants me to have it. Just make it happen before she finds out. I stepped inside. Before I find out what? She spun around, her cheeks flushed. Private call. Not when you're using my husband's accounts, I said. For the first time since we'd met, she didn't have a quick retort. She grabbed her bag, muttered something under her breath, and brushed past me out the door. I let her go. By nightfall, Daniel would have filed the final motion. That evening the phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. It's done, he said. The judge signed the order. She's locked out of every account, effective immediately. Tomorrow morning, the hospital gets the order restricting her access to William's care. And the forgery? I asked. We hold on to that for now. But if she pushes again, we'll use it. It's a loaded gun in our pocket. I didn't sleep much that night. It wasn't worry that kept me awake, but anticipation. Margaret had been pushing me into corners for weeks. Now she was the one about to be cornered. And when the sun rose, I'd be standing right there to watch it happen. The courthouse order was still warm from the judge's pen when I stepped into Daniel's office the next morning. He slid the crisp document across the desk. "This is it," he said. "Today, Margaret loses everything she's been clinging to." I traced a finger over the bold black letters. Restraining order, financial and medical authority. My name was there. William's name was there. And so was hers. The language was cold and clinical, but the meaning was sharp as glass. She was out. I folded it neatly into my bag. "Let's go." The hospital lobby was bustling when we arrived. The scent of coffee and floor polish mingled with the low murmur of voices. Nurses in scrubs moved past us, pushing carts carrying charts. Daniel walked beside me, his leather briefcase swinging at his side. "You want to do this in the hallway or in his room?" "In the room," I said without hesitation. "She's hidden behind whispers long enough. This ends where it began." When we stepped into room 312, Margaret was already there, perched on the visitor's chair with one leg crossed over the other. She was reading from a paperback novel, but her eyes flicked up the moment she saw me, and then to Daniel. "What's this?" she asked, closing the book slowly. "A delivery," I said, walking to the foot of the bed. William's eyes moved between us, wary, like he could sense the air tightening. Daniel set his briefcase on the rolling table, clicked it open, and pulled out the order. "Ms. Allen, this is a signed court order effective immediately. It removes you from any and all decision-making authority regarding Mr. Hanley's medical care or finances. You are barred from accessing his accounts or authorizing any transfers. Violating this order will result in criminal charges." Her face didn't change at first. It was the practiced stillness of someone who's been cornered before and refuses to show it. But I saw the twitch in her jaw, the slight flare of her nostrils. "This is ridiculous," she said finally. "William wants me here. I stepped forward, my voice steady but loud enough for anyone outside the door to hear. "William married me. Legally. First. And you married a man who was already taken. That makes you nothing in the eyes of the law. And now everyone here knows it." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the beeping of the heart monitor. Margaret's gaze shifted to William, searching for some shred of support. But William didn't speak. He just looked down at his hands, fingers twitching against the blanket. "Tell her, William," Margaret pressed. "Tell her you want me making decisions for you." He lifted his eyes to hers, then to mine. The weight of years, of choices, of betrayals, seemed to settle on his shoulders all at once. You can't," he said finally. It was barely more than a whisper, but it landed like a gavel strike. Daniel slipped the order back into his briefcase and handed a copy to the nurse who had stepped into the doorway during the exchange. "Please ensure this is added to Mr. Hanley's file immediately." The nurse nodded, eyes flicking between us. "Of course." Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," I said quietly. "And you know it." She stormed past us, the scent of her perfume lingering in her wake. I watched her go, not with triumph but with a strange calm. The storm she had brought into my life was finally losing its strength. When the door closed, William looked at me. "Eleanor." I shook my head. "Don't. There'll be time for words later. For now, just rest." In the hallway, Daniel's voice was low. "She'll be angry. She may try something desperate. But legally, she's finished." I nodded, my mind already shifting to the final step. Not just removing her from William's life, but making sure she could never circle back to mine. And that, I knew, would happen very soon. It was raining the morning I closed the door on Margaret's shadow for good. Not the kind of rain that pounds on the roof in a frenzy, but the slow, steady kind, deliberate, unhurried. The kind of rain that feels like it's washing something away. Daniel had called me just after breakfast. "The forgery charges," he said. "We're filing them today. Once the DA sees the bank records, it'll move fast." I sat at the kitchen table, the steam from my coffee curling into the cool air, and let his words sink in. Filing the charges wasn't about revenge anymore. Not entirely. It was about drawing a line so deep that Margaret couldn't cross it again, not in this lifetime. By noon, I was at the courthouse, sitting beside Daniel while he handed the documents to the clerk. The thick file landed on the counter with a soft thud. Months of lies, manipulations, and forged signatures, all condensed into paper and ink. When we stepped back out into the rain, Daniel looked at me. You know, this will likely mean probation at best, maybe a short sentence. But it will stain her record. Any bank, any hospital, any court, she'll carry this with her. That's enough, I said. She's built her life on appearances. This will break them. 2 days later the call came. It was the nurse from the 3rd floor. Mrs. Hanley, I thought you'd want to know. Ms. Allen won't be returning. The hospital received the court order and she's been removed from the approved visitors list. I thanked her and hung up. My hands felt steady for the first time in weeks. That afternoon I went to see William. The room felt larger without Margaret's presence, lighter somehow. He looked up from the bed, his expression tired but softer. She's gone, he asked. Yes, I said. This time for good. He nodded slowly. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I pulled the chair closer to the bed. William, this got as far as it did because you let it. I can't change that. But I can make sure it doesn't happen again. He didn't argue. The weeks that followed were quieter. I took control of the bills, the medical updates, the property records. The accounts Margaret had drained were frozen, then reallocated under my sole authority. Daniel helped me move what remained into safer places, places only I could touch. Every so often I'd hear from him about the case. Margaret had hired a lawyer, tried to argue the forgery was a misunderstanding. But the paper trail was too clean, the handwriting analysis too damning. She's negotiating a plea deal, Daniel said one afternoon over the phone. No prison, but a full admission of guilt, restitution, and probation. That means she'll have to pay back every cent she took. I smiled faintly. Good. Let her work for once. On the first warm day of spring, I drove out to Sunset Chapel in Arizona, the place she'd thought she'd stolen from me. The red cliffs glowed in the afternoon sun, and the wind carried the faint scent of desert sage. I stood outside the little stone building, my hand resting on the weathered wooden doorframe, and thought about how close I'd come to walking away from all of it, from my home, my name, my life. Instead I'd stood my ground. And I'd won. That evening, back in my own kitchen, I sat with a glass of wine and let the quiet settle around me. The rain had returned, tapping gently against the window. I thought about the months ahead. The legal cleanup, the adjustments with William, the inevitable whispers from people who'd only heard part of the story. None of it scared me, because I'd learned something in all this. People can take your time, your peace, even your money, but they can't take your voice unless you let them. And I wasn't letting anyone silence me again. When I went to bed that night, I left the curtains open. The street lights spilled soft gold across the room, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the world outside was mine again. It wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning, one I'd fought for, one I'd claimed. And in the stillness before sleep, I realized something else. Margaret had been wrong. I wasn't just clever. I was unstoppable. What would you have done in my place? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable true stories like this one.